My name is Millie Cumming. I live in southwestern Ontario, and I've been a quilter for nearly 30 years. I started somewhat traditionally, but very quickly made my own quilts, even early on, and started submitting to shows quite early on as well. Um, I have a website that I jointly do with my husband, because he was a professor of art education, and so we feed into each other. And his work has some parts that are related to me, and vice versa. And if you look on my website, you would see three different kinds of main quilts. One is memory quilts, meaning very personal, very relation to people who are no longer here or important events. And I would put this one in that category. I love vintage linens, and so I have a lot of vintage linens that I keep buying and using. And I have been cottaging since I was about 5 years old. So a lot of my quilts are cottage quilts, which really is where my spiritual being is, in my old canoe. So this particular piece, I have submitted and had quilts in a number of Grand National exhibitions. In a few minutes, I'll maybe show you a different one that from 2017. But Crossroads, they suggested that you use something that would be particularly a junction in your life. And certainly the biggest crossroads for me was, as I say in my artist statement, it was 1984. I was on the cusp of living or dying. And it's been very interesting doing this because, well, several reasons. One is that there's a lot of resonance with all the images and the tragic stories that you hear about the pandemic. So I will be interested to hear how many quilts are about the pandemic when the show does open. And also because I was a physician. I was first a family physician in a church hospital in northern BC, but then 19 years in palliative care in Vancouver. And that very much relates to much of what I do and what's important to me and so on. So this is what this piece is about. In terms of process, I wanted to put the whole artist statement in the quilting all across the back. And so I experimented with little bits of the fabric I was going to use with the batting, and practiced a free motion writing text. And so you'll see it, but can't really read it, but it is there. So that the whole back was that first. And then I played around a lot with what I was going to do. I wanted it to be quite stark, as some of the pictures are that we see now with the pandemic. This is a photo transfer, obviously, of myself. I think it looks terrible and it looks gray, but when I nearly died and had 3 surgeries and so on in 1984, the surgical report said she was very pale, almost greenish. She was toxic and rather incoherent. And so I didn't mind so much that it looked so awful, because it's probably what I did look like at that time. I wanted me to be small, and I wanted there to be enough things around to suggest that it was in a hospital bed, but I didn't want too much. These are, I love vintage linens, so these are actually upholstery fabrics. And this is actually a vintage public health sheet. It says here, public health printed on it. I would have loved a hospital one, but I didn't get that. And this in the bottom is a vintage flannelette sheet, very much like you even see today in a hospital. So I didn't care too much. And I put some graphs and things, but I didn't care what they really showed. It was just enough to say what it was about. Another part on the artist statement, I said, working in healthcare, I should have been terrified, but there was that bright, white, warm light surrounding me. I felt loved and totally cared for. There was nothing to fear, all was well. Now, in this pandemic, I think of those in intensive care also on the cusp. I wish for them that light and warmth and hope that regardless the outcome, they too will feel that love. And in the last 2 weeks, I've lost a very dear friend of cancer, and another dear uncle died a couple of days ago. And I very much, and certainly in my work in palliative care, I also felt, regardless of a person's religious feelings or whatever, I wanted to convey that feeling. And it was hard to do, to give that lightness and brightness. I did experiment with beads and various things. And in the end, I did use Angelina, which just gives it that shimmer. Some of it is tacked down and some is sort of loose because I wanted lights to catch it in different dimensions. And so there may be little bits that look like it's falling off, but I have a hand sewn it as well as fused it on. And if I can give an example of one of my little cottage quilts, this is the same Angelina, but it's at the cottage and a big full moon on the water. And again, the same Angelina over top. I did experiment with some other ways as well, but in the end, that's what I went with. So that is my piece called All Was Well. Back in 2017, I said I was in the Grand National, and that theme was Oh Canada. And so I'll show you a little bit of one quilt, because it's quite big, and it is on the website. But basically, I had cancer in 2016 with a lot of chemo and radiation, et cetera, et cetera. And so I did a whole gathering of many, many things of my cancer journey. And for each of my quilts, I have tons of binders, tons of photographs. And so for the cancer one, I kept all sorts of bandages and meds and all sorts of stuff that might get used in that quilt. And another quilt, which is a baby carrier, an art piece for the wall. It was about being a first-time mom at age 41. And so I started a whole journal on baby carriers and things about Mother Earth and the fabrics that I might use, et cetera, et cetera. And when I do a trunk show in person, it's a lot easier to take whole books, and because I think that's one of the areas that gives me a lot of I'm happy about doing that, and that's part of my whole story. I've actually started a second book on this because I couldn't get it all in this one binder. I do a lot of rust pieces because I love rusting fabric, and I do a lot of cottage quilts, which are on the website. But this, for instance, is just a photo transfer with my beloved canoe that I bought at age 15. And again, relation to this one, I used very glitzy fabrics, threads to put that in. So that was an example. And one of the many rust quilts, this one was in my corner of the world. And it's about the disappearing farmlands and the wonderful, wonderful farms that we're seeing less and less of. Complete with the very first yardage I ever bought. I thought it was just beautiful. That was back in the 90s. I have a huge fabric collection, um, but a lot of it is secondhand or unusual, men's ties, women's silk uh, shirts, um, all sorts of unusual things. And as I say, this yellow piece was this yellow piece and this piece, the gray, were new, but absolutely everything else was secondhand. So some of the rust pieces I'm working on right now, uh, a very old quilt that I couldn't get $1. The auctioneer couldn't sell for $1. And quite a bit of it has gone into a quilt that's going into the Studio Art Quilt Associates global exhibition in a different quilt. But resting on that with rusty nails that I get on the banks of our river, because we're right on the river. And I have done some dyeing and fabric painting and inks and various, but I think the ink, the rust especially gives me pleasure. This is an umbrella stand. And it's not easy to hand quilt through, not very good on your machine either, but it is, you like dyeing, you're never quite sure what it's going to come out like, but it does bring me a lot of joy too. And I think of my grandfather on his farm and things like that when I use a lot of old rusty pieces too. This is a big rust piece from about living on the banks of the Grand River and the various things that happen on the river, and the horseshoe, because there was a horse barn just down here, and a thistle because it's a Scottish town. And I like to do really good labels that talk about what the piece is about. So I think we'll end it at that. And thank you very much.